The second point, write this down, and this is a researched fact. The #1 way to raise self-esteem? Volunteerism. Volunteerism. Volunteer in any form. Volunteer in your community. Volunteer for a charity. Volunteer at your kid's school. Volunteer within your trade association. Any type of volunteerism. Right, Kathy, raises self-esteem. How many of you in here do volunteer? Raise your hand. What do you do, Jeff?
Involved with a couple different boards.
Boards and stuff? Chris?
Coach.
Coach, cool. Coach. Anything else? Anybody else? What else? Volunteer. Help at kids' school. Great. Let me tell you one last little story before we take our break. It involves volunteerism, and I hope it will inspire those of you who did not possibly raise your hand to volunteer individually, volunteer and get your children involved, and volunteer as responsible company owners. Volunteerism was one of my core values. I'm passionate about it. I've always volunteered. Be it wherever I lived, I would look for an activity that I could wrap my arms around because something about it resonated with me. I moved to Chicago 8 years ago, didn't know anybody, didn't know where I was moving to, certainly didn't know what I'd volunteer for, but I thought if the student was ready, the teacher would appear. About 4 months into living in Chicago, I read about an event called the Avon Breast Cancer Walk. And if you're familiar with it, because I believe they did it in Atlanta too, yeah. So I signed up to walk 60 miles in 2.5 days from Kenosha, Wisconsin to downtown Chicago. Now some of you might be wondering, why would I do that? Well, there were a couple of reasons. Number one, I had no clue what the Midwest was. When you live on the East Coast, you know there's a West Coast, but you have no clue that there's anything in between. So I had no idea where I was moving. So I thought if I walked from Wisconsin to Chicago, I could see a couple cities and towns along the way. I didn't know anybody in Chicago. They anticipated 4,000 people participating in this event. I thought, well, I could make a friend or two, if I was lucky, even get a date. So that was another good thing. Number three, I owned a health club. It was one of my businesses. I've always been in the physical fitness industry, and I thought I'd never challenge myself to walk 60 miles. I like challenging myself, so that was another reason. And lastly, I have a good friend who's a breast cancer survivor, and I thought I could raise the money and walk in her honor. It had all the components of being the right volunteer activity for me. Here's what I didn't know. My idea of the great outdoors is the distance from the limo to the hotel lobby. I was kind of like Goldie Hawn and Private Benjamin. Remember that movie? They gave her Army fatigues, and she said, does this come in any other color? That would have been me. This gal has never really shopped in an Army Navy store. I bought things like pup tents, backpacks, canteens, just not in my vernacular. But I was up for the challenge. Well, the first day we walked 17 miles in the rain. Not a good hair day. Got into what they call base camp at night, where we had to sleep in pup tents so little that you had to get dressed horizontally by flashlight to make sure you weren't putting your underwear on your head. I brushed my teeth in a freestanding sink in the parking lot. I took a shower in a truck. I was questioning why I was doing this. But the next morning, I got my first clue. We got up at 4 a.m., not a time I usually like to get up, but they wanted us to hit the road at 5 when the sun was coming up. They'd published our walking route through all the local newspapers in town so people would be aware when all these thousands of people would be marching through their town. As we started the walk, about 5 a.m., I got my first clue. There were people on the front lawns of their houses sitting in beach chairs, holding banners that they had made that said, "Thank you for doing this for my mother, for my sister, for my brother." When I saw those people out there at 5 a.m. with those signs, I knew why I was doing it. I walked a little further. People still out there, maybe didn't have a sign, but came out just to wave at us and say, "Thank you." People drove by, quickly rolled down their car windows, stuck a hand out and said, "Thank you." With each step, I had more purpose. And then I came to the little kids. The little kids who had made chocolate chip cookies and drinks for us, and their little handmade cards, which they handled us, so many of which I saved. This one said, "Dear Walker, thank you for walking for all of us. We are so proud of you because you are a lifesaver," with a little lifesaver candy attached to it. Or in their little kid script, they'd write me little different notes, and this one had a Tootsie Roll on it and said, "You're on a roll, girl," but I ate the Tootsie Roll. And as I collected these cards from these kids, I thought, how great are these parents for knowing what they're doing for their children by having them support our volunteer efforts and telling them what they're doing and why. How great are these parents? We walked 22 miles that day in the blazing sun. I was hot, I was tired, I was blistered, I had rashes I'd never seen before. We collapsed when we got to base camp at night, and 600 volunteers had set up our tents for us and cooked us a hot meal under a tent. I witness kindness at a level that I've never experienced before in my life. See, when you feel good about yourself, when you volunteer, you're naturally kind